global Cram videos for studying the night before the test. Today we'll be talking about globalization in the 20th century. Globalization is when people or businesses from different countries come together and interact with one another. There were several causes to globalization, such as the introduction to new technologies like the internet, the spread of capitalism globally, global interdependence of economies. Also, there was easier trade transactions because of organizations like NAFTA, which reduced trade barriers. Fifth is the IMF and other organizations that help reduce poverty in developing countries. There are also several effects of globalization, including the increased income difference between developed and less developed countries, outsourcing jobs by companies for cheap labor, increased unemployment rates in developed countries, and horrible working conditions, which also led to child labor in developing countries. There was also global warming, which was a major effect, and here's Ward with the weather.
Thanks, White. Well, the first example of globalization can be seen in our forecast. Globalization has caused irregular weather patterns, which have already started showing results. Like last week it was 90 coming into June, today it's 56. What makes it so hard to predict the weather nowadays is seasons can come sooner and last longer, or vice versa, come later on and last shorter. So it's difficult to predict. Globalization caused global warming, and this impacted not just people here in New York, but you can tell from this attempted weather forecast, but everywhere around the world. Yeah, globalization has really screwed us and our Earth's animals over in the recent decades. Globalization is caused by burning fossil fuels, which produce greenhouse gases, which therefore trap the sun's heat in Earth's atmosphere. Therefore, global warming leads to an increase in global temperature, which can cause the weather to change frequently. Global warming is a cause of globalization because with increased trade and travel of people or companies of different nations, there is a need for more fossil fuels to be used, such as petroleum and coal, which increases global warming. Global warming caused the destruction of some of the Earth's regions. As temperature continuously rises, the glaciers and polar ice caps melt, which destroys the habitats of the penguins and the polar bears. The increase in temperature destroys their habitats, and scientists are arguing that the emperor penguins who live in Antarctica should be classified as endangered. Penguins are threatened by changes in sea level because as global warming increases, the polar ice caps melt, which increases the sea level, which destroys their habitat. And this is driven by climate change. Globalization has affected the world in the 20th century because it causes global warming and climate change, which nearly endangers species like the penguins. Well, while we're talking about the penguins, it brings me to my next topic of globalization. Sports. The Pittsburgh Penguins beat the Ottawa Senators in the NHL semifinals this week in double overtime of Game 7, with the final score of 3-2. The Penguins will face off the Predators in the Stanley Cups with the series best of 7. Globalization has spread different sports around the world because of increased communication between countries around the world. One example of how sports spread was soccer. Soccer was created in England in the mid-19th century, and it is played throughout the world. Soccer spread because of the organization called FIFA, which was founded in May of 1904. The World Cup is a tournament of 32 teams competing for the championship. They have to go through qualifiers and the group stages. In 2005, around 207 countries were registered in the FIFA organization and were competing around the world to qualify for the World Cup. And as FIFA spread across the world, there are other leagues created, such as the MLS, Barclays Premier League, and the La Liga. There are over hundreds of thousands of soccer teams in the United States alone. This is a picture of the Maspeth High School boys soccer team. Soccer is only one of the sports that has spread worldwide due to globalization. For another example, I'll use hockey. Hockey was created in 1845 Canada and has spread around the world because it became an Olympic sport in 1920. and it has spread worldwide. Olympics is a sports event that happens every 4 years with teams coming from all over the globe to compete for the gold. Now, there are hockey leagues all around the world, from youth to professional. Globalization allowed for these sports to spread because as people travel to new areas, they bring their cultures and sports with them, and this spreads among the people there. The reason globalization occurred on a larger scale in the 20th century than ever before brings us to our next topic, television and the internet. James, back to you.
Thanks, Ward. Well, television has contributed to globalization because it has spread news faster and worldwide in an instant. For example, last week in Manchester, there was a bombing, and the people who died, God bless their souls. But here in New York, we heard this less than 10 minutes after it happened. Television has spread news worldwide rapidly and has connected the world with hearing about business transactions and crises. Along with television, the internet has increased globalization by increasing communication. The internet connects people all over the world through instant messaging. I am able, for example, to chat with my cousins in Egypt over Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, Skype, thanks to the internet. Both the internet and television have connected the world by spreading news and information. In today's world, we are all linked together by the internet, and in this case, cause and effect is a tricky thing. Increased technological advancements led to globalization, but globalization also led to increased technological advancements. Television and the internet are an example of how globalization has increased in the 20th century. Globalization has increased rapidly during the 20th century for several reasons. 1. Advances in communication and transportation technologies increased the rate of globalization as countries became more interdependent through increase in trade of goods, services, money, and labor. 2. Colonization of countries in the beginning of the 20th century, and this connected countries and the people from all regions of the world. People of the mother country have come to the colonies and interacted with each other by spreading their ideas and cultures. 3. The Cold War with superpower countries influenced developing countries with trading. Cold War was occurring between 1950 to 1991 and has connected countries through alliances like the Warsaw Pact and NATO. 4. World wars connected the world because the mother country used their colonies during the war for supplies and soldiers, which is called total war. 5. Increased need for cheap labor after the abolishment of slavery in the 19th century. Now countries were looking for a new source of cheap labor. Countries have moved factories to developing countries because they outsource their jobs for cheap labor.
Well, to end this video off, is globalization truly a turning point in world history? First argument, 20th century globalization is not a turning point in world history because it has been around since the beginning of human history. Globalization has always occurred because humans migrated to different lands and regions following their food supply. Globalization is not new to the 20th century. Humans have always interacted and traded with each other, even before written history. So, globalization is not a turning point because it has been around since prehistory. For the second argument, 20th century globalization is a turning point because due to globalization, countries around the world are now interdependent on one another. With globalization increasing, trade also increases and countries become more reliant on each other. Globalization is argued to have been a major factor of the Great Depression spreading worldwide. Globalization removed the essential diversity of the economy, and now thanks to globalization, countries around the world are dependent on others for resources and other products. For the third argument, 20th century globalization is a turning point because it has increased global prosperity and companies have become more powerful than some countries. The biggest companies have been more powerful because their businesses can operate globally, while politics tend to be a regional affair. Companies open factories around the world and outsource their jobs overseas, which allow them to hire people for less money, which in fact allows them to gain more money and power. Globalization marked the rise of companies and industries' power over some countries. So globalization is a turning point in world history because even though it has been around since the beginning of human history, it has been on a far greater scale and has led to interdependence of countries and global prosperity for the most part.
Thanks for watching.